Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. History doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. Not the first time. This has happened before. We've been here before. Been here. So we're asking why. Not
Watching
the
so
first
much World
time.
Cup, I'm used to the countdowns.
I know. Slipping into that British accent.
Yep. A lot of
you're-
British people, man, they care about soccer.
Everybody
They really
knew you
wanted
were
to come home, don't they?
They really do. And now we get to relive the Falkland Wars. That's going to be fun. Little Argentina versus England.
Give the
Surely
Falklands War a
they've
shout
gotten
out.
over that one.
Yeah. And who are you going for, Cameron?
I've got a pretty strict rule I live by to never root for the English. So yeah, I've been to Buenos Aires, so I'm waving that flag, baby.
Yeah, I feel like I got to go for the Americas here.
Yeah. Fair. Why are you never rooting for the English, Cameron?
Because I'm an American. And this is America. What do you mean?
And your
I don't know,
French
man.
ties, you have like double reason to hate the English.
Yeah, a lot of the Frenchness in me too. Just I can't do it. And as much
Yeah.
as I've tried, my dad's side is English, but he came over like Mayflower time, so that's diluted. It's out of here. I'm an American, and yeah, we don't do the English.
All right. Well,
That's
that's fair. All right, everybody. Well, welcome back to Not the First Time. It's been a minute since we recorded. Last time we recorded was maybe a month ago, right?
Yeah,
I
I'm
think so,
sorry about that.
Hey, I mean, life happens, right? So we had the 4th of July. We had to celebrate America. And whatever else got in the way. So we're back. We're on Cuba Libre Part 2. Is this going to be Part 2 of 3 or Part 2 of 4? Do we know quite yet?
We don't know quite yet. That's kind of the fun of this series is we'll see how far we get and how much more we need to get into. But looking at the script today, we might have 4.
Yeah. I mean, we still haven't even gotten to the big one, Fidel Castro. I mean, God, that could be a 4-part series on its own. So we'll see.
All right.
Yeah,
So I'm hearing maybe 5. I don't know.
Well, we're gonna try not to. I mean, eventually this administration's gonna catch up to our timeline, and us being strategic and trying to educate the masses on Cuba. We need to get it before this country attacks Cuba again. So we can't extend it to 5 episodes because I don't think we have that much time.
True.
Foreshadowing. Does Cameron know something that the rest of us don't? I don't know.
Ooh, well, they're pretty transparent with it. Not really reading the tea leaves here, just listening to what these morons are saying.
Fair. All right. Well, for those that are joining us for the first time, this is a show where us 3 normal dudes try to figure out what the hell is actually going on in the world. I bring the questions for Cameron and Andrew here, and these two bring the political history and the context of the situations that we're talking about here. And we're just trying to make sense of what's going on because we're not experts, but we're curious and we want to know what's happening in the world. And so today we're back talking Cuba, part 2 of an undetermined amount. But Ikis, where did we leave off last time, man? We catch us up to what we were talking about.
Yes, well, last we left off, we were following Jose Marti, who's Cuba's most revered, treasured historical figure, and he had just orchestrated a Cuban war of independence against Spain. And it is worth revisiting this for all subsequent episodes after this. But to catch people up a little bit, he was mostly living in the United States. He spent every waking hour writing, speaking, organizing a revolution while traveling throughout the United States. He became actually somewhat of a celebrity, especially within Miami with the massive Cuban American population that was there. But in 1895, he decided to essentially put his money where his mouth was and actually go to Cuba to fight in this war. And that is where, unfortunately, he was tragically killed in battle just 3 months into the war. So I think that just about brings us to where we left off last time. And the impact of this is huge because, I mean, for some sort of historical comparison, imagine if George Washington would have died 3 months into 1776. Like, that would have been a massive loss. And it was for Cuba. Jose Marti became a martyr. And again, it's worth us mentioning this because Jose Marti's martyrdom is very important to the rest of Cuban history. He will be evoked and referenced and mentioned and called back to by almost every single Cuban leader from here on out. There's massive statues of him all over the island, and he still remains that massive central character.
Yeah, and on that note, Ekis, we just to remind people of where we're getting most of our information. It's this great American history of Cuba from Ada Ferrer. Just unbelievable book. Cannot recommend it enough. But Jose Marti is an interesting character because he's really the only person in this entire saga that everyone likes. That is revered on both
Sure.
sides of the political spectrum. I mean, it's not even like a both sides thing, which has been so fascinating with Cuba because there are a million different factions, different people getting into power, different changing of. You can have super leftist people who still disagree and kill each other in Cuba. It's a very interesting political system, but Jose Marti is the guy that everyone kind of reverts back to. So we are going to mention him in subsequent episodes as well because he is that important.
Love it. And what were we talking about last time? Didn't he have a pretty crazy history as far as like being in Cuba, then he got sent to Spain, then he was in the US for a little while. Like, wasn't he just bouncing around between all these places? And is that part of this love that people were able to kind of like be around him and meet him and hear what he was talking about and the goodness he was sharing?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, he went to jail when he was 15 for having like idealistic, forward-thinking views. So I mean, from the very start, he was an idealistic person that wanted to change Cuba, and yeah, had to live in exile in the United States for most of his life. Which is why he's revered with the Cuban American population. It's also again a perfect example of just the close, interconnected ties that Cuba, and the United States have. That Jose Marti, for a large part of his life, was in and out of New York. He went throughout the South, and again, even in his death, is also the perfect example of someone who put his money where his mouth was. You know, he wrote and championed these causes, and he was willing to die for it at the end of the day, which is essentially what made him the martyr that he is. And after Marti's death, this obviously emboldened the war. It emboldened the Cuban rebels that were fighting. And in just 90 days, the rebel army marched over 1,000 miles from the mountainous eastern side of the island toward Havana in the west. They fought 27 major battles, and they had Spain on their heels. It's interesting that one observer of this war was a young Winston Churchill who traveled to Cuba to see the war for himself. And this always is fascinating to me about history, but this was a thing that people just did. Like back in the day, a war was going on and you would just travel there to watch it and like talk to generals and see what was going on. Winston Churchill did this in Cuba, and he almost died when a horse was struck by a bullet. It caused the horse to fall just inches from where he was lying. He was taking cover. He was almost crushed to death. It's just one of those amazing little history what ifs of if Winston Churchill would have died in Cuba.
Could you imagine?
It's crazy.
Yeah, that would be crazy. He just died in Cuba by a horse. History might look very, very different had that horse fallen a foot to the right, you know?
Very
Yeah,
different.
and who would History Bureau's favorite person be if Churchill had gotten crushed at that
It
point
would
in
have ruined
time?
everything.
What was Churchill doing at that time? I mean, like he just went to go visit and show up, or like did he
So
have a
this is-
prominent role?
No, I mean, this is pre World War I. So he's a young military officer. Again, probably I don't know the specifics, but I'm guessing he was probably sent on assignment to keep tabs to see, you know, what weapons are being used, tactics. Like there was another, like it's done all the time to send like officiants over there to take tabs. But yeah, he was essentially there just observing the war. Almost.
Yeah, I mean,
almost
we talked
died,
about
too.
in the first episode, he was he had the craziest British title for it, but he was basically like the head of their navy before World War One. So I'm sure it was some sort of exercise to kind of see. And Ekis is dead right. That's one of the reasons why World War One was as bloody and violent as it was, is because before that, war was viewed as like theater almost. It's like it was a to-do. You went to the battlefields and you like saw it. And like the French in the beginning of the war, like one of their famous things is they were still wearing their like dress robes and like the crazy colors that they were doing during the Napoleonic War, which in World War One was a lot easier to fire machine guns at. It was just the way the world viewed war before World War One was just, it's a little like mystifying.
Yeah, it was very romanticized. So, I mean, it's like what a gentleman would go to do. You know, you would like, it was expected that you would go fight in war and wear your uniform. And as this war and subsequent wars, especially World War One, would show, is that war is nothing to be romanticized.
Churchill's the first war intern. I love it. There we go.
And back in the United States, people were obviously watching this war closely. The U.S. had ever-growing investments on the island, and this put Cuba on the front page of the news in the United States. Over 7,000 newspapers were continually putting news of Cuba on their front pages. And coverage of the war is also what helped launch yellow journalism in the United States. And this helped kick off Hearst's career. Yellow journalism in a nutshell is if it bleeds, it leads. This is when this starts. This is a much larger story, though I'm sure we're going to dive into yellow journalism at some point. But it just should be noted that this early war in Cuba is really what had started to put a lot of attention in American media. Spain, however, was not about to roll over easy, and they started a brutal counterinsurgency just as the rebels were gaining steam. Spain also doubled down and put their pedal to the metal. And this is when they instituted concentration camps, and they relocated thousands of people from the rural villages into these condensed camps, and in total some 200,000 people would die in these camps, which was 1/10 of the island's population. Spain is not going down easy. They are really clinging to this, and we did mention it somewhat briefly last episode, but this was Spain's last sort of grasp on their imperialistic history. This was a moral sort of symbolic thing for them. Like they really wanted to hang on to Spain so they could have some sort of semblance of the glory that they once had. And by 1898, the war was climbing toward a bloody conclusion, and after 3 years of fighting, the rebels were on the verge of victory. But the Spanish again stubbornly continued the fight. All the while, the U.S. was getting squirrely. All this war wasn't so good for business. And U.S. policymakers tried to urge Spain to grant Cuba autonomy. The U.S. was like, hey, just give up. Give the rebels what they want. Let's restore order and let's just go about business. Spain didn't like this approach, especially the Spanish nationalists in Cuba. This open U.S. support for Cuban rebels caused Spanish loyalists in Cuba to attack offices of the U.S. consul on the island, right? So this U.S. suggestion to end the war is backfiring horribly. So in response to this, the U.S. stationed a battleship called the USS Maine in Havana's port. This was essentially a show of force, something to deter any more attacks on U.S. property in Cuba. Meanwhile, with this shadow of the U.S. military now cast over Cuba, Cuban rebels and their liberation army prepared for a final assault. This was going to be the final blow. They was kind of heading into one final climactic battle when something really, truly remarkable happened. At about 10 p.m. in the dead of night on February 15, 1898, the aforementioned USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, killed 260 U.S. sailors at the end of the explosion. To this day, it remains a mystery as to exactly what happened. Though many believe that this could be somewhat of an actual false flag, many accuse this of the U.S. staging the explosion as a pretext for declaring war on Spain. Conspiracies always run wild on what happened at the Maine, but regardless, 260 Americans lost their lives at the end of it.
Yeah, and this as we have become a very conspiratorial society in the United States, it is kind of an important note here that the USS Maine is sort of the first of these false flags throughout history that, whether it have been a false flag or not, has just been labeled as such ever since. And like Ikis just mentioned, with the kind of business interests that were aligned in Cuba, more so than I've really ever seen in any other war, the U.S. had business everywhere. We had bought basically the entire island. So anything that was going on in Cuba that was bad for U.S. business was going to be taken over immediately. So that's kind of where the conspiracy theories started here, because obviously the Civil War, you had the South attack Fort Sumter. That wasn't a false flag. And obviously Revolutionary War, it's the same idea. So this was sort of the first time you see that, and unfortunately not the last time. Obviously kind of the more popular ones, the Gulf of Tonkin, Vietnam, and then the sinking of the Lusitania, and the Zimmerman Telegraph in World War I. So it's as kind of the first time that we see this. And again, to reiterate, this is the start of the yellow journalism. So William Randolph Hearst owning the newspaper, basically the sensationalism of it, the "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain" was written as the headline in his newspapers to kind of stir up the emotion to get the populace to go along with taking over Cuba, essentially. So it's just an interesting kind of moment that this started here with the Maine, and we kind of still deal with it today.
Crazy. last episode we were talking about how the American Revolution was largely funded through Spain, and then as a proxy through Cuba. Uh, is this the focal point of just like a souring relationship ever since U.S. independence and us trying to say, hey, Spain, like, stop doing this? When did that relationship turn as far as the power structure goes? Because it seems like we were relying on them, and then now we're going after them.
I mean, this is the beginning of that turn for sure, as we'll get into. There is a complete 180 in terms of the power structure of what's about to happen. But it's like Cameron was saying, there was definitely a smoking gun. There was certainly so much pretext for why the U.S. would have staged this attack to go into Cuba. But we'll likely never know. That's the thing. And I think some recent analysis of it has even pointed to some sort of like accidental explosion that happened, that caused this. But there was it also certainly could have been one of those angry Spanish nationalists that did bomb the ship. Again, we'll never know, but 260 Americans died. And like Cameron was saying, this became insanely sensationalized. And it was seen as America's kind of first 9/11, right? It was a surprise attack on America. We have 260 dead Americans, and immediately there was just a thunderous cry for war, and a lot of that was caused from this yellow journalism of if it bleeds, it leads. They definitely hyped up the hysteria, and it pushed us towards war.
What's the belief amongst you two on what actually happened there?
I don't know, because I had always, coming into this, I had always believed that it probably was a false flag. That's maybe just more of my conspiratorial side going into it. But then as we learned, Americans had already died in Cuba, right? When there was that Confederate-led invasion of the island to turn it into a slave state, right? There was hundreds of Americans that died there, including the son of the U.S. Attorney General, right? So we had already been through that, and there wasn't war. I think especially after the Civil War, when we couldn't turn Cuba into a slave state, the need to go into Cuba also died down. So I do probably tend to believe that it was either an accident, a very mistimed, unfortunate one, or again, it's Occam's razor. I don't see it unlikely or out of the question that it was just an angry Spanish nationalist that found an opportunity and did it.
Yeah, and I view this war as slightly too early for politicians to really have to worry about the court of public opinion. Like World War I and World War II, it makes a little bit more logical sense just in terms of the widespread news and being able to be connected a little bit more than, the end of the 18th century. I don't think we would have killed 260 of our own sailors. I mean, I say that now. I totally think we could have. Like, that was stupid. But in this particular scenario, I would tend to agree with Ecos.
And again, like we always say, never let a good crisis go to waste. This is another perfect example of that. Because the amount of public and political pressure to declare war in Spain was immense. Like I said, President McKinley soon gave in, and on April 11th, 1898, he received congressional approval for war. And this was just a month after the Maine exploded. So this is a tremendous movement to go from the ship exploding, sailors dying, to now we're at war again. However, this declaration of war that the U.S. just placed on Spain came with an interesting clause. It was known as the Teller Amendment, and it stated clearly that the U.S. was getting involved only for pacification. It inserted that when the war was over and the island was returned to peace, the United States would leave control of the island to the Cuban people. However, whatever that meant exactly was left unclear. And I think to your earlier question, Rhett, there's still some semblance of support. The memory of the revolution and of this two-way street between Cuba and the United States is still there, which is why I believe they put in this amendment. It's a very interesting amendment to put in, because we could have easily have just invaded, but we went out of our way. It was actually a senator from Colorado whose name was Teller, so it's called the Teller Amendment. He went out of his way and had to fight pretty fiercely on the Senate floor to get this amendment put in place. And again, essentially said that we're just there to help the Cuban people, and then we're going to move on.
Yeah,
in a lot of ways, it was Operation Cuban Freedom, which is exactly what we said about Iraq.
Whoa. And so can you just simplify the Teller Amendment as, hey, we're just trying to keep adversary away, keep
Yeah.
Spain further off the coast than they would be, right?
Exactly. It was in a weird way, kind of like the Monroe Doctrine, right? Where it's like we're getting Spain out of there. We're here to invade and occupy, but to help the Cuban people take control of Spain, to kick Spain out, and then we're gonna leave, right? That was the amendment.
I'm guessing that it maybe didn't go that way. I don't know.
Oh, we're gonna get into it. So Americans, we grabbed rifles and we headed to Cuba to fight against Spain to help the Cuban rebels secure independence. And the Cubans, however, as we said, though, they were very close to victory. They were gearing up for their final climatic battle. And now, with the U.S. involvement, Spain stood really no shot. I mean, Spain, again, was already basically a cornered animal. They didn't have anywhere to go. And now you have the full military support of the U.S. getting involved.
Yeah, really quickly, because sorry, on that note, right, when you asked that earlier, when the tensions between the U.S. and Spain started switching, that wasn't really the important one. It was Spain versus England. They were battling out in these areas for 200 years, and the French as well. The three colonial powers beat the hell out of each other, to the point that it got Spain to the position that the U.S. could finally stand up to it. 100 years before, there's no chance in hell the U.S. could have done this. And we have to keep in mind, this is pre-World War U.S. too. This isn't the superpower that we know it as today. We would have gotten our asses kicked by all three of those countries. But at this point, Spain was a percentage of what they were.
Yeah. So that kind of ties back to a previous thought or question from the last episode. Is it was almost like Spain was just funding their demise, right? When they were backing us for the American Revolution, because they allowed us to be powerful enough to do this while the other countries were chopping them down, right?
Yeah, it's the same reason we got the Louisiana Purchase for so little. Is the French had no money left either because they were battling all these wars. So all these countries, I mean, we had to fight the British, but between the French and the Spanish, it just became easier to give in to our demands than try to hold on to it because they had islands and they had areas that were more important, and they just, instead of defending all of it, they kind of had to pick and choose their battles.
And Cameron, you make a good point that the U.S. is not a world power at this point. We are, at this point, a regional power, but one that's also rebuilding. This is just after the Civil War. And the Spanish-American War ends up serving as an opportunity for national reconciliation after the Civil War. It was the first war fought since the Civil War, but not really, because the U.S. government was still firmly entrenched in its genocide of Native Americans by 1898. But this was the first, that whole thing. And then but it was the first opportunity for the U.S. to flex its muscles as a nation after the whole experiment almost came to an end because of racist secessionists. And so this was, again, with the advent of yellow journalism and now a chance for America to come together, really, through war, which is also very American. This became an uncontrollable movement, really, in America. In all, though, the conflict with American involvement would only last 4 months, and it had very minimal casualties for the U.S. Battle deaths amounted to around 400, which is relatively small in comparison to other wars, especially the ones to follow. But it is one of the most important events in U.S. history because of what it did to our national identity. This is the beginning of Team America World Police. It's the early beginnings of an America that... It is an America that saw itself as a force to preserve freedom and democracy around the world. So the Spanish-American War is ostensibly the beginning of the American Empire.
Right. I'm curious, as sort of a fan of history, but a little bit of coming into it, let's just call it blind. How much of the Spanish-American War did you know about, before we started talking about this stuff?
Nothing, truly.
Okay.
Yeah, it's something that I saw it in the script, and I was like, I'm curious to learn about this and hear about it, but it's not something that I was ever read in on or was very aware of up until this point.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I figured. I remember like my AP US history teacher is the man who got me into history. Love Mr. Mod, shout out. Guy got me into history, and I remember he took like a couple days to go through the Spanish-American War, and it was the first time I'd ever heard of it. And I'll kind of touch on the Philippines here in a second, just to kind of fill in like what this all was about. But it is a weird. It's a weird war in U.S. history because we don't talk about it. It's a win technically, but we just we don't celebrate it. It's not glorified at all, and then it's just something we sort of skip from the Civil War to World War One, and it's just very interesting to me.
Why do you think that is?
I honestly don't know.
I'm going to get into it a little bit with the Philippines because I'm going to bring it up simply because of I think that's the reason we don't talk about it. We did some horrible things. And yeah, so we'll get that in just a second.
And you just shouted out, was his name Mr. Mod?
Mr. Mott.
Mr.
Great
Mott.
man.
I wish we were at a point in this podcast with our listeners. We'd be like, hey, if anybody knows Mr. Mott, get this out to him so that he can hear.
I'm sure he's teaching America's youth amazing history somewhere. That man lives and breathes history. He's the dude. I cannot speak enough about how awesome that guy was for me.
I could imagine you'd probably be pretty proud that all these years later, he still had an impact on you. So.
Absolutely.
All right, I digress. But okay, so we're not quite sure. Well, Cameron has a theory on why the Spanish-American War was just kind of swept under the rug and not really spoke about, but we don't really have any other theories on that.
I mean, that's certainly part of it, but I genuinely don't know. I feel like it's probably because it's right before the two world wars, which obviously takes, gets all of the attention with the U.S. But it is weird to me because it is, like Cameron said, it is a victory. It's one that, as we're going to get into, is fully baked into American mythos of this war. So I don't know. It's strange,
and it's one of
especially with
the most popular presidents of all time. Like we're talking Teddy Roosevelt here.
It's a perfect segue.
Kind of adds it even weirder.
Yeah, perfect segue because again, like this war with Spain has fully entrenched itself into American lore, and that is in large part because of the Rough Riders, who are a volunteer group of American frontiersmen who possessed exceptional horsemanship and marksmanship, and they would go on to fight in several battles of this war, and they have gained legendary status. Now, Teddy Roosevelt, who was then Secretary of the Navy, resigned from that post so that he could lead this volunteer group once war with Spain was declared. Roosevelt wasn't about to spend this war at a desk giving orders. He wanted to see action, and he wanted to lead that action. And the Rough Riders are a very, very interesting, diverse group consisting of the full spectrum of Wild West society. There was outlaws, there was lawmen, there was lawyers, there was Catholics, there was Jews, and there was literal cowboys that made up the ranks of the Rough Riders. Should be mentioned at this point that most cowboys in the American West were either black or Hispanic. Although black soldiers were barred from joining the Rough Riders because the U.S. was still fiercely racist in 1898, it is interesting to note that most of the Rough Riders were Hispanic Americans from New York and Arizona. And it's also interesting because they were the descendants of Spaniards. New Mexico and Arizona. They were the descendants of Spaniards. Yeah, no, very key distinction there. But it's interesting because they are the descendants of Spaniards who settled the American West centuries before. And so despite what Hollywood tells you, real life cowboys were more Pedro Pascal than they were John Wayne. I think has been whitewashed a little bit in terms of how we see cowboys.
So DMX Rough Riders anthem, is that a homage to this?
Probably more accurate than John Wayne.
Truly.
PDMX. Just had to throw that in there.
We got to work that in.
Hey, that's history too.
Yeah.
Now, in the most famous battle of the Spanish-American War, this was the Battle of San Juan Hill. The Rough Riders, who were led by Teddy Roosevelt, led a daring cavalry charge up a heavily fortified hill. The Americans took heavy casualties in what would be the bloodiest battle of the war, but it also saw the Rough Riders as the heroes. They charged up the hill, they defeated the enemy, planted the American flag. It's all very cinematic. And I am actually shocked, like genuinely shocked that there has never been like a big budget Hollywood blockbuster about the Rough Riders, especially
This
because
is
it's
literally
led by
going to be one
Teddy
of my
Roosevelt.
questions.
It is strange. I don't understand why it hasn't been in the media zeitgeist of the U.S.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a hell of a story, and Teddy is the absolute best. For anyone who wants a little bit more on the Roosevelts, both Teddy and FDR, Ken Burns' documentary on the Roosevelts. It's like a 8-part series. It goes through both of them, Eleanor Roosevelt, the families, but it is so fascinating. It is American royalty if we had it. Sorry, Kennedys, but I'm giving it to the Roosevelts. They are infinitely fascinating people.
It's true, and Teddy Roosevelt would actually be awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions on San Juan Hill, and he is to this day the only U.S. president to be awarded the Medal of Honor, which I think is very interesting.
Looks like there was a TV miniseries on the Rough Riders back in 1997.
Nice. Well, I'll have to remember when I was 4 years old if I watched that one.
Check out some miniseries.
That is crazy to me because I mean, Andrew, what you're describing, it sounds like a Hollywood blockbuster. You know,
Yeah, you have a group of cowboys charging up a hill, winning a war for America. It's so cinematic, and it's just I really don't understand why it hasn't been celebrated more. It's strange.
I mean, does that kind of tie like it seems to tie in with this whole theme of this Spanish-American War and like not talking about this history with Cuba, like this part
It's
of
swept under the
our
rug.
history is just so untalked about. It's mind-blowing to me.
Truly.
And I think we're still working on finding that answer. We talked about that in the first episode of like, why is that? What are we getting to? And honestly, we've now gotten to 1900 and still have that question. So got to keep working, boys.
Kind of work cut out for us. Here we go. All right.
So at the heel of these daring victories, Spain was crushed, and the U.S. was able to claim a pretty impressive victory, honestly. But what about the Cuban people, right? Like the Rough Riders is fun. It's very cinematic, but what about the Cuban people? And see, the thing is that the Cubans, again, were on the verge of victory when the Maine exploded. They were this close to winning the war without the U.S. But as destiny would have it, the Maine exploded and the U.S. joined in the 11th hour and then claimed total victory for themselves. And in the aftermath, they completely ignored the Cuban people. See, the U.S. negotiated a peace deal. Go ahead, Cameron.
Really quick, because Ada Ferrer in the book had a very poignant section there that there was a ceremony done where all the Spanish flags were lowered on the island at the same time after basically the defeat of the Spanish. After all these years, all these battles, all the blood, sweat, and tears taken into taking out the Spanish, and they lowered them all at the same time, and the flag that rose was the United States. Not the Cuban flag. And it's just sort of a perfect metaphor for the whole situation is they did all of this work and the flag that rose that morning was the Stars and Stripes.
So what changed from the Teller Amendment to this point? Because it kind of seems like, I mean, is this us saying like, hey, we're here to stay, or is it just like, hey, we won this war and it was all because of us and we're out?
Well, we're going to get into it. I think that is the perfect segue because the U.S., right, we claim this victory and we begin immediately to negotiate a peace deal with Spain, and Spain only, right? We completely left out the Cuban revolutionaries. Cuban people were not given a seat at the table of their own revolution. And one Cuban soldier put it as if the U.S. had won the revolution and then France led negotiations with Britain without consulting any of the founding fathers. And this is exactly what happened with Cuba. The U.S. and Spain signed treaties in Paris, again, leaving out Cuban representatives. And in these treaties, they signed over the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and Cuba to the United States. And again, there were no representatives of any of those countries represented at these discussions. And the U.S. to this day still holds possession over Guam and Puerto Rico from these treaties. So they're still very active. We still are in the ripple effect of these treaties.
Yeah. And this is where I'll kind of touch on the Philippines. I know this is a whole story on Cuba, but it is the parallels between the fight for independence for the Cuban people and the fight for independence for Filipinos is very similar. Both fighting the Spanish for hundreds of years, or 100 years, whatever, to try to gain their independence. And during the peace treaty in Paris, the Treaty of Paris, basically their independence got put up too. So we got the Philippines without any say from them, and it immediately started just a ripple effect of violence throughout the country. So essentially, following it, the Philippine nationalists proclaimed independence, and that was originally a call from kind of separatists, but eventually the president of the Philippines also urged the people to basically carry arms or pick up arms against the United States. Started as like conventional warfare, turned into guerrilla warfare. The war resulted in at least 200,000 Filipino civilians dying, mostly from disease and famine. But the United States, we put together concentration camps during this time. We had torture camps during this time. We killed villages en masse because of basically retaliatory efforts. So the guerrillas would do something, and then we would go in and just massacre entire villages. Stuff that we don't learn about. And this arguably is one of the more genocidal periods or events, I think, that the U.S. has ever gotten involved in. And that's why I think there's this haze over the Spanish-American War, because of this Filipino piece. So yeah, they war crimes were committed all over the place on both sides. The U.S. carried out literal scorched earth tactics and just burnt down forests and put people in concentration camps. So that's what we did in the Philippines during this time. And if you haven't heard of the Spanish-American War, I sure as hell don't think you've heard of the Philippine-American War, because it was a lot worse.
Yeah, and that is a genuine forgotten about, swept under war, because I kind of see that it is a separate war, and I think it lasted even close to 10 years, or like it was a pretty substantial amount of time. That is completely forgotten about and just absolutely horrific.
In time frame wise, that was right after the Spanish-American War. I mean, is that
1998? Yeah, or 1899
started. So U.S. is coming off Spanish-American War. We are signing these treaties, and we're just taking this land over from people that, I mean, classic American expansionist, I guess, agenda, right? We're just taking this land from people and not caring what they have to say or what's happened there over all these years. And here we come. And so...
Yeah, and not to get completely off track here, but just a second for the poor Filipinos. So we held that position until World War II. Who took it from us? The Japanese. So really, after us, they got the Japanese. And what I always found very fascinating, having kind of studied a little bit of the atrocities that we committed in the Philippines, is it wasn't even a question of who the Philippines was supporting in that war. That's how brutal the Japanese were. That they saw the atrocities that we committed, and they're like, fuck that, I'll still take that over what the Japanese are doing. So pour one out for the Filipinos. They had a rough time there.
And again, it's worth repeating too that the Philippines was a U.S. territory for decades, which again I think is largely forgotten about.
Unless you ask Douglas MacArthur, he'll fucking tell you.
But ultimately, the U.S., they occupied and took possession of Cuba. And as Cameron was saying, on January 1st, 1899, the U.S. flag would be raised in Havana, and none of the Liberation Army were permitted to be in the city at this. And like you were saying, Cameron, imagine, like they had just spent the better part of 30 years fighting for independence, losing their brothers, daughters, sons. Their homes were burned. Their countrymen were enslaved. Their country's greatest hero was killed in the process. They put everything on the line. And then by sleight of hand, their land still belongs to someone else after they won their independence war. And it's also worth pointing out, again, just the blatant disregard for Cuba in the name of the war itself. And this is something that Ada Ferrer touches on in her book, that it's called the Spanish-American War, right? So in a war that was for and about Cuba, that was fought in Cuba for the most part, Cuba isn't even worth mentioning in the name of the war, which again is just another microcosm of Cuba getting forgotten about and supplanted by bigger powers. And in the end, U.S., we dissolved the Liberation Army, which is some 50,000 men. I mean, it was a massive force that we were able to dissolve. And then we did what we do best. We changed the terms of an existing agreement. The U.S. then said that we would leave not when the island was pacified, which was the original terms of the Teller Amendment, but we would now leave when the island was deemed self-governable. We also provided no details on when or how Cubans could prove that they could be self-governed. And the U.S. basically said, we'll leave when we feel like it. And immediately, the U.S. started reorganizing Cuba. I mean, we took control of their politics and economy. We put in place one General Leonard Wood of the U.S. Army. He became the de facto leader of the island, and he ruled with an iron fist. One of his initiatives, however, was building thousands of schools in Cuba, which, on the face value, sounds wonderful, right? Like schools and investing into education is a beautiful thing. But the intention of these schools was to exercise a sort of soft U.S. power. Essentially, they were meant to indoctrinate young Cubans into becoming patriotic Americans. The plan was to essentially erase their cultural identity the same way that Canada and the U.S. had systemically tried to erase the cultural identities of dozens of indigenous tribes in their respective countries. So this was just standard operations for imperialists at the time. Beyond that, we completely screwed over the Cuban landowners. We put in place a sort of pay-to-play land redistribution bill, and we even decided who would have voting rights in Cuba, and that being wealthy men. The first election in Cuba for local leaders was peaceful, but the people obviously voted for revolutionary people. All the people that were voted into office were the loudest ones who were calling for the expulsion of America. This created a pretty tense situation, and General Woods, who was the ruler of the island, even called them political rascals and urged Cubans to change their vote. And Cubans didn't listen, of course, right? They still wanted autonomy, but tensions were rising now, right? You have control of this island. People are putting in place a democracy that we want, but it was phony. So the U.S. decided to call in a constitutional convention, and this would be one meant to settle relations between the U.S. government and Cuba once and for all. But essentially, it was trying to pave the way to turn Cuba into a puppet state. So in 1900, this constitution was drafted from these meetings, and the U.S. doubled down on what they wanted, and they said that the new Cuban constitution must include clauses that allow U.S. military free reign in Cuba. Land must be given to the U.S. to build naval and military bases, and it also limited the Cuban government's ability to make treaties or deal with foreign nations on their own. The U.S. made sure to work in what is also known as the Platt Amendment, and this wrote into Cuban policy that Cuba must pursue policies that align with U.S. interests. Cuba could not enter into any international agreements, and it also gave the U.S. the ability to intervene into Cuban affairs anytime it wanted. So it's really, again, gave the U.S. full control of Cuban politics and economy.
And the Platt Amendment is viewed as like the worst thing that came out of this war. Like the Platt Amendment, if reading this book, is mentioned 1,000 times as the motivation of like, what the hell? What were we fighting for? What was the point of all this? And the U.S. just came in with this, and it basically, any decision Cuba wanted to make, they had to run it by the U.S. Like, ultimately, that's what it was, is there was no decisions for the Cuban people. They fought all of this stuff, and the Platt Amendment such an American thing. We threw an amendment on it, and we're like, yeah, nope, you're not doing that. And it kind of, the next few chapters of this story revolves around the Platt Amendment. It was kind of that bad for them.
Do you guys think the Platt Amendment was the goal the entire time?
Yes. I do, because the business interests are crazy. The business interests down there from the Confederacy onward. I mean, before then, even it's always been a money making island. The sugar cane there has been, like we talked about last time. Columbus didn't realize it, but the gold that he found in Cuba wasn't gold; it was the sugar, and the sugar cane. That has been the cash crop ever since. And the U.S. got in on that early and often, and our business interests. I mean, it dictates the next part of this story, is because of so much business interest and so many U.S. landholders. It makes this very complicated.
Yeah,
Andrew,
and
what
it's
do you
also.
think?
Well, it's classic American policy because we're trying to have our cake and eat it too at the same time. Like, we want to fully occupy and bring in a new territory into the U.S., but we also want to play that heroic actor on the world stage of bringing democracy, right? Like, we liberated Cuba. So their workaround to that was putting it to basically forcing the hand of the Cuban Constitution to give them. It's a very weaselly, sneaky way to take control of an island and still claim like you're liberating the island. So yeah, in a lot of ways, it was the end goal, and this is also the culmination. I mean, think about almost the entirety of the first episode was the U.S. like reaching one in Cuba, and now we have it, we've gotten it, and so it is the end of that long story from the founding fathers to Monroe to now. It's a Cuban territory, or an American territory that is a fake Cuban territory.
I mean, yeah, it seems like a situation to just dumb it down to a ridiculous example, but it's like the kid that's doing all the work in a group project, and then the kid that didn't do shit comes in and is like, "Hey, I mean, obviously we did stuff, but it's like taking credit for all this, taking over. It's like that was the game plan the entire time, is what I'm hearing, and it seems, to your point, so weaselly and so sneaky and just outright disrespectful. To go in under the guise of helping the Cuban people and doing it for our own interests at the end of the day. I mean, I guess follow the money as we've talked about in the past, or follow the not oil in this example, but to Cameron's point, the business opportunities that are coming through this, like we were just going to let that go. There's no way in hell we're just going to let this slip through our fingers and give it back to them, right?
Yeah, and the Cuban people had no choice also but to adopt this constitution, especially after 30 plus years of fighting. They've already had been through so much, and just the prospect of fighting another uh, regional power was just not in the works. And there was also plenty of power mongers that were eager to accept these terms and hope that it would set them up for life. Like this always happens in these situations. There's always people that just can't wait to be coattail riders. And this also becomes a massive, massive problem for Cuba in the coming story, are these people that were essentially willing to sell themselves to the highest bidder, which was the U.S. Then, in 1903, the U.S. ends up working out another deal with this de facto puppet government of Cuba that they just created. This new agreement guaranteed 45 square miles of territory that stretched up a large bay on the eastern coast of Cuba that was called Guantanamo. This, of course, becomes the infamous Guantanamo Bay Naval Base, which is still a very active U.S. base that has been caught up in scandal after scandal since it has become the favored place to torture those deemed enemies of the U.S. And it was very active in the Iraq War for this. Guantanamo should terrify every single American because it is a piece of U.S. sovereign land where no law really applies. We can essentially do anything to anyone who is unfortunate enough to find themselves on Guantanamo Bay. There is no due process in Guantanamo, and the crimes against humanity there still play out to this day. But that is, of course, a story for another time, which I'm sure we'll get into. Now, 3 years...
Go
ahead.
I'm laughing. I'm not laughing at what goes on there, obviously, but just the fact that could be a whole nother story. And at the time that we got Guantanamo, like the history of it that we know today, of just like the media of Guantanamo Bay and being this like high security prison area, did that immediately start once we took it over? Like, were we immediately doing those sorts of, I don't know, lawless things there, or did that become a later use of Guantanamo?
Nah, you got to grow into that kind of thing, dude. You don't just start with torture. It takes 40 years of figuring out the best way of doing it, and then we get there.
It takes a global war on terror before you unlock that aspect.
Different brown people that we tried to kill. And
okay. Shame on me.
Now, after three full years of occupation that Cuba was a U.S. territory, we had the Platt Amendment that was solidified. We now just put permanent U.S. bases on the island. The U.S. did, in fact, pull out of Cuba, but we left Cuba a shell of a country, and it was still an unofficial province of the new American empire. We gave ourselves full control of their government and economy and wrote it into their law in order to justify our ability to do this. This now brings us to 1914. Of course, in July of that year, World War I starts, and the world, including Cuba, would change forever. World War I doesn't so much involve Cuba directly, but it was such a destructive war that it nearly destroyed all sugar beet fields in Europe, and it obliterated long-standing trade routes. This meant that Cuban sugar went from high demand to astronomical demand, to the point that in 1919, just 1 year after the war ended, a single Cuban sugar harvest generated $1 billion in revenue, which was the biggest boom in Cuban economic history. But this caused a massive bubble in the Cuban market, and just as soon as those checks cleared, the bubble burst, and sugar mills all over the country defaulted. Something like 20 branch establishments went defunct, and this closed 334 bank branches around the country, so people lost all of that money. And amongst this crisis, American banks bought the dip. American banks scooped up as much as they could, and 1/4 of Cuban sugar mills now passed to New York City Bank alone. And by 1922, 2/3 of Cuba's sugar harvest was produced by U.S.-owned companies. Now, this U.S. dominance of the Cuban economy isn't new, right, as we've talked about for this episode and the last, but the changes brought on by World War I and its aftermath accelerated this process and made U.S. power in Cuba that much more entrenched.
We're just robbing these people, man.
Yeah.
At this point, it is just a smash and grab, just as a complete smash and grab. And again, just the constant exploitation of Cuba is what's now being baked into U.S. policy.
Good Lord.
Yeah, and literally the next 40 years of Cuban history is like this. The backroom dealing, the shady politicians. Like, I've got a story here in a second about, cash getting transferred in briefcases. Like, that's what happens here, and it's U.S. business with U.S. government permission to do so.
Yeah, like, I mean, dude, why do Cuban people want to even live here or like America? I mean, I know what is coming as far as like there are other layers to this story, but like question one of this journey is, why is there love for the United States from Cubans? I mean, at this time, it seemed like that would be completely off the table, right? Did that
At
later
this
shifts
time,
change that again?
The problem
Or
with
is this
Cuba
still,
is it's
like-
never been an island for Cubans. So, like, between the Spanish being there and then the U.S. being there, so, like, you have to keep in mind, although the Spanish got kicked out during this time, they still own half the island. Like, Spanish people stayed there, and they had already purchased a ton. And then the Platt Amendment came through. Basically, correct me if I'm wrong, Ekis, but during this time, we also lifted a bunch of sanctions and tariff relief for Cuba, which on paper sounded great, except for the companies that were selling the Cuban sugar were American purchased or American owned. So like the money didn't actually go back to the Cubans there either. So these people, the entire history of this island has been the actual people who live there and the actual like natives to it have had no say in any of this.
And it does get very complicated for what we're about to see, because the U.S. begins exporting an enormous amount of products to Cuba. We essentially saw Cuba as a massive untapped market, and it was. And so we started putting in fashion, machinery, railroad equipment, appliances, like you name it, we were selling it en masse to Cuban buyers. And the biggest of all was cars, to the point that the U.S. sold so many cars in Cuba that by just 1919, Cuba ranked among the highest in cars per capita worldwide. And this, again, gets complicated because we were essentially plugging Cuba into the new American empire, which is not so different than when Rome conquered a region. And just to have some historical comparison here, when the Roman Empire would conquer a region, they would basically copy paste its way of life and infrastructure into that land. It's the reason why there's Roman ruins, roads, and amphitheaters from Scotland to Baghdad. It's also why that countries like Spain, France, Italy, Portugal, and Romania all speak languages derived from Latin, which was, of course, the bureaucratic language of Rome. It's a sort of cultural superimposition, right? You're dropping your culture on top of another place. And what happened in Cuba was a modern version of this, right? You're getting influxed with luxuries and modernities. This is making a lot of people wealthy. You're getting introduced to new things that you never have before. And so that's where there's that dichotomy of you're getting plugged in to America. You're getting plugged into its economy. This is bringing a sort of affluence to the island that it's never seen. But this also comes with a big downside, which is a massive wealth gap, especially since a lot of that wealth is going to foreign investors. And we start to see that tug and pull now that becomes a very central story to the rift between capitalism and Marxism. But it starts here because we're trying to just supercharge Cuba to be American, and through consumerism, through products, through buying things. And at the same time, American tourism explodes in Cuba. The island becomes America's #1 travel destination, even over Europe. And it does make sense when you think about it, because it's much more cost effective, and it just makes more logistical sense to travel to this island paradise that's just south of you than it is to go to the French Riviera or South America. Like, it's just a beautiful destination that people with the money want to go to. And the amount of American tourists to Cuba tripled after World War I, and Cuba essentially started to build one of the world's first tourist economies because of this. And some Cubans even saw tourism as the island's second most valuable crop after sugar. And you have to remember that we're now heading into the 1920s. 20s is the Gilded Age. Think the Great Gatsby. America at this time is turning into a machine for millionaires. Like America is just printing money, becoming so wealthy and powerful. And this new American elite wanted to choose Cuba as its place to basically have fun and play. And the island became the top spot for business meetings, for retreats, for honeymoons, for getaways, anything. Americans really looked for any excuse to spend a few nights in Cuba. And this also coincides with prohibition in the U.S. So while alcohol is illegal in the U.S., just a plane ride away on a tropical island, you can get plenty of legal alcohol, and thousands of Americans traveled there to get a good buzz going on. And to add fuel to that fire, gambling was also legal in Cuba, and it basically became the Vegas before Vegas. It became America's #1 place to party. And Ernest Hemingway especially loved Cuba. In his words, he loved Cuba because it provided both fishing and fucking, which is essentially how Americans now looked at Cuba.
The man is a wordsmith.
I've been to Hemingway's house in Cuba, which was really cool, and saw his boat. I can't remember the name of his boat. You guys might remember it, the one that he was taking out at night and looking for Russian U-boats with later.
I love
But
Hemingway.
also
That's
saw
amazing.
he had like this writing tower. Well, first off, we went in his house, like saw his bedroom. I have pictures of it. It's crazy. One of the tour guides in the place, we were taking pictures around this door, and she ended up asking like, "Hey, do you want me to take your phone and go in here and like take pictures of stuff you can't see?" Crazy.
That's amazing.
Had a bunch of like writing on the wall of markings. I can't remember exactly what he was like marking, but took pictures of that, and then got to see his like writing tower. So he had a tower off the pool in the back of his house, and you could walk up to the top of it and go into his writing room, and it looked over downtown Havana.
Cool.
And it was so cool to see. I have this picture of my dad there, obviously reason we took that trip, but holding Old Man in the Sea and sitting on Hemingway's doorstep, which was just so cool.
That's incredible.
That's amazing.
Yeah, really, really
That's
awesome.
amazing. And also indicative of this, because I mean, Hemingway is maybe America's most revered writer, other than, oh my God, what's his name? Tom Sawyer. Why am I blanking on his name?
Mark Twain.
Mark Twain, right?
Samuel
It's like
Clemens.
Hemingway. Yes, good call. But Hemingway is a giant of American culture, and he's choosing to live in Cuba, right? Like he loved Cuba. He wanted to live there, and he wanted to base his operations there. And it's just a direct callback to what Cuba is becoming for Americans.
Yeah, and I don't know if we're gonna. I mean, I don't know how much we're gonna go into like the mob rule of Cuba at the
I
time.
got you.
Are we getting into that?
So on that note, good segue
pretty
there,
fascinating.
right? That's literally
Yeah.
the next part we got here. So I
Okay.
do kind of just want to take a second just to point out the mob ties here in Cuba, because it's just such a cool
It's
little
insane.
nugget
It
of
is wild.
history here. I mean, Cuba is definitely, so at this time, it was not a stranger to mob ties. I mean, they've been using the island and conducting business 90 miles off the coast of Florida for 50 years at this point. But mostly what they were doing at this time was running the island as a transshipment point for alcohol, especially during Prohibition. So they were just basically rum runners out of Cuba for a long time there. But the mob's accountant, Mayor Lansky, he saw much more potential for the island. And once Prohibition had ended, the mob basically needed to find another source of income. And that's where you'll bring in maybe the most famous mobster of all time, but Lucky Luciano. He basically fell in love with Cuba. And how they got into it, and this story has not been confirmed, but it's basically folklore within Cuba and the United States. But when Lewinsky, when he first met them, basically he met with the president at the time, Batista, at his hotel. And the story never been confirmed, but Lansky opened the suitcases, Batista stared at the money, and then both men shook hands. Didn't say anything, just shook hands and left. I'm like, that's incredible. So again, it's kind of going into what Cuba was at this time, and this became like the hot spot. I mean, Frank Sinatra would spend time down there. We're about to get into Babe Ruth, but it was kind of the American Riviera. And although Luciano had to escape the United States and basically secretly went over there, everyone knew that he was there. There was no hiding it. He was out with celebrities, taking people out to lunch. He tried to give a car to a senator's wife, just all sorts of things. And it's kind of rubbing it in, but 90 miles away, and the mob freaking loved it.
Yeah,
and it plays a big part because, like, Bautista, like you said, the president of Cuba, is just openly corrupt, allowing all of this to happen. And it does play into what happens later of just this open corruption between America and the elites.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating to me, the story on it. And there's a really good book, Havana Nocturne, I believe is the title of it. And it talks a lot about the mob influence in Cuba. And essentially, I mean, Cameron, you're kind of hitting on this, but with the prohibition in business in the United States, when that all started cracking down or going away, I guess, they were looking for, like, where was their next land. And so this, like, almost became a mobster island. And for it almost would have been if there weren't for some events that I'm sure we're going to talk about coming up. But it's just so crazy that literally they almost started up like a de facto country.
Well, the only reason that Lucky Luciano left is because the United States, we threatened to withhold all the pharmaceutical exports to Cuba. Basically, we're going to cut off all medicine to the island unless they shipped him back or took him out of the island. I'm not exactly sure what ended up happening to him, but we basically threatened healthcare in order to shut that down. But that was after, years of him just partying on this island, which just sounds
so crazy.
Incredible with Frank Sinatra, dude. Like, come on, that's awesome.
Also, another anecdote from being there was they used to the mobsters would always meet at the Hotel Nacional, and it was like right on the boardwalk. And went to the hotel, saw the room that the mobsters used to meet in all the time. I mean, like, in open, these guys were like coming together, wanted criminals in the United States, like meeting in the open at this hotel. And it's the history there is just mind blowing to see these places and to, like, having stepped foot in it and seen these areas and these rooms where people have. Lucky Luciano was meeting with fellow mobsters in Batista and talking about the future of this country. So cool.
Yeah, and it's because they got what they always wanted, which was like an unregulated island away from U.S. law, where there's an endless stream of people showing up that want to spend money. And once they were able to buy the government, it was just a true no-holds-barred Wild West of mafia activity. And really, it really was the Vegas before Vegas. And I think they probably even used the blueprint that they got in Cuba to start Vegas. And he's not the only celebrity, because Babe Ruth even starts playing winter ball on a regular basis in Cuba. And it's interesting to call out Babe Ruth because baseball was maybe one of the biggest cultural imports that we would bring into Cuba. Cuba was also way ahead of its time in terms of how they handled the makeup of their teams. Cuba had an integrated multiracial baseball team before the United States. And these included games where Cuban baseball promoters would fly out entire MLB teams and have them play against mixed-race Cuban teams. And in one of these games, Babe Ruth was held hitless, while Afro-Cuban star Cristobal Torriente had 3 home runs against top MLB pitchers, and the Cuban team would win 11-4 against an MLB All-Star team, which I think is just awesome.
That is incredible. It's a bunch of smoking cigarette 40-year-old white dudes. It's like, yeah, you're going to get murdered against the Cubans. Sorry. I watched the World Baseball Classic. It still happens to this day.
It does.
What's that Shane Gillis skit where he's talking about baseball and the first homer being hit on a white guy, or the first home run being hit on a white pitcher, and he's like, yeah, see, like, that pitch came in. He's like, oh shit, that was a home run. Like,
yeah, that was the day that they switched from the old timey calls to up, and it's gone.
Yeah.
Serious. And so Cuba is slowly but surely becoming American, to the point where we have mobsters and baseball that's running rampant on the island. And this eventually opened up new channels to the point where President Calvin Coolidge visited the island. And this is historically significant because he was the first and only president to visit the island of Cuba until Obama did so in 2016. That would have massive ramifications, and was also why you were able to go there, Rhett, is because Obama eventually peeled back a lot of those restrictions, while also getting a little bit far ahead of the story there. But it's worth calling out that there's only been two, Coolidge and Obama, which again is strange and doesn't really make sense to me, especially given the close ties of the two islands. Obviously, what's about to come, though, the communism, will get there, because in the midst of all this, this influx of baseball and cars, there was a bubbling opposition party within Cuba that loathed this Americanization. You asked a question earlier, Rhett, of why did they like Americans? Well, a large part of Cubans didn't. They saw this as what it was. It was their cultural identity getting supplanted by an American identity. And Cubans still didn't have sovereignty that they wanted, right? Like, they were still a puppet state of the US, and now they were becoming a party destination. And the universities in Cuba really started to foment massive liberation movements against US power in Cuba. The University of Havana in particular served as a focus point and became a hotbed of this liberal movement. They were led by a student named Julio Antonio Mela, and he co-founded the Cuban Communist Party in 1925. And from there, he orchestrated a wave of strikes and protests. He was promptly arrested on terrorism charges. He'd later escape to Mexico City, where he became friends with Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo, which is, again, just a crazy mixture of histories and famous people. But this was big because just as Cuba is getting inundated with American capitalism and consumerism, it's getting counteracted by Marxism. And again, as I said last episode, Cuba always finds itself at the extreme of the time period that it's in. And Cuba in the 1920s and 30s was a microcosm of this capitalist Marxist dichotomy. Capitalism is plugging Cuba into modernity. It's bringing a lot of wealth. It's bringing a lot of luxuries that the island has never seen, but it was coming at the expense and exploitation of the average Cuban. This exploitation of everyday Cubans led Mela and the new Cuban Communist Party to declare two clear enemies. One was American imperialism, and two was the corrupt Cuban officials like Bautista, who was shown a briefcase by mobsters and said, "Where do I sign?" And these became the two largest enemies of the Cuban Communist Party: American imperialism and corrupt Cuban officials. Mela and his idealistic group of students were the founding fathers of communistic thought, and it would dominate the island for the rest of its history. But I think with communism taking hold due to American imperialism, it's where we'll pick back up for next episode as we introduce maybe the most famous of all Cubans, Fidel Castro, is going to make his presence known here in a little bit.
Oh, man. And folks, it is
Dude.
about to get wild. There are things
I'm
about
so
Fidel that I
excited.
had never knew before reading this. We'll start off with kind of armed rebellions and revolts, and we got prison time. We got a leader in here that was kind of the pre-Fidel Castro who shot himself on the radio. We'll get into awesome stories coming up here. But yeah, Fidel, brother Raul, we'll get a little Che Guevara going. This is where we're going to get into, I guess we can consider modern Cuba, because where we stand today is basically built in 1959. So it's, this is going to be a fun part.
So excited. It gets batshit. And
It really does.
That's batshit from what I know about it. And so for you guys to bring the additional craziness that I know occurs here, I'm so stoked to learn about it. So really, really excited for part 3.
So am I, because I was always under the impression and taught that like communism in Cuba was like self-contained, right? Like it was like their problem and kind of held to them, but it's indirect. It's the direct ripple effect of U.S. occupation that in this influx of capitalism, consumerism, that Marxism takes hold. Like it is a defiant act against the American empire to start to really lean into communism. And that was central to Fidel Castro. And this is also calls back to Jose Marti and his martyrdom. Jose Marti warned about letting America put its boot over Cuba and get involved and it's already happened by the time Fidel Castro is born and comes into power, where again there's baseballs, there's cars, there's mobsters. Like it had already been Americanized, and it leads to so many wild events.
Yeah, man. It's like how do we not expect stuff like this to happen, right? When you come in and you exploit a people, you take what is there is you start like making a certain part of the population wealthy. Like that's a match on a in a tinderbox,
Well,
right? Like
because
you are.
at this time, I mean, the British had been doing this to countries for 400 years, 600,000 years. So this is just the way of the world at this time. Like, we just viewed it as, yeah, this is our property. It's 90 miles away. Of course it's ours. Like,
Yeah.
oh, there's people. No, we don't worry about that. Like, don't worry about the people there. I mean, Big Papa British, like, they're the ones who showed us the way here. It's only like in modern times that it's not a radical idea to think about the person you're conquering, like who they are as a person. Like before,
Yeah.
I don't know, the 20th century, no one ever thought about that. It didn't matter at all. And the Cubans, unfortunately, they take the brunt of it for this entire story. It doesn't get much better here. It sucks.
It doesn't.
I mean, and I know obviously we have like the foresight to like see these situations how they played out back then and be able to look back on it and apply that to other situations that's happened, that we could continue to see a similar pattern happen time and time again, where you it's like this vacuum. We create a vacuum and people get pissed, and then there's a revolt, or there is a group that comes out of it, or the people stand up, and it's just mind blowing to me. It's we time and time again, this is something that we talk about. It's crazy.
Well, it is the military industrial complex. Like, it really is. It becomes one of like the big forces of history, where there's a constant carrot and stick of wealth and money to be made, and we keep following it without thinking about what you just said about the people, the future, what's going to happen. Because as long as Americans are stuffing their pockets with money, we don't care until we have to. And we're about to get into a few decades where we have to care now. And we kind of have to pick up the pieces of what we've done.
Mm-hmm. And nothing says you kind of fucked up than nuclear warheads pointing right at you, not far away, literally stones throw away from your continent. We were minutes away from the world's destruction, and I believe we're going to get into that next week. Hopefully this again doesn't extend to too many, but we should be able to fit in some missile crises as well. Crises.
Oh, yeah.
Love it. Well, do we feel like we're any closer after this episode? Cameron, I know you and I were talking even earlier today about like, do we understand the love and hate between the American and Cuban people relationship, and the hate from some Cubans of the Cuban government and the country, and love for America? Do we have any closer idea to why that is at this point in time?
No, not at all. Where we are in history right now is literally we're just on the teeter-totter of who is torturing the poor Cuban people. Next episode is we're going to start getting into, again, the modern Cuba, of why it's set up the way it is today, why the political factions have kind of formulated the way they are today. Because until this moment, it's changing constantly. Every generation of Cubans was fighting a different battle against a different person. For the next chapters, it's basically the big battle against us and the overall battle of communism versus capitalism. So it gets a little bit easier to follow just because now this is things that people know. This is the world that we live in. But no, right? I still haven't figured out why there's this reaction. So we're going to get to it.
Fair. Love it. All right. Great job, fellas. Thanks for an awesome episode. We got to round out, as always, with the question of what's still good in the world. Anybody got anything on the agenda for today?
Yeah, I feel like it's a little bit of low-hanging fruit, but I do have to call it out. And it, especially from where I'm at, for me, it is the U.S. hosting the World Cup, because I thought it was going to be a complete disaster. Honestly, I did. Like, I didn't think it was going to go well. But being in Philly, which is a host city, it has actually been really cool and impactful. Especially walking around the city. I mean, you see groups of French fans and you see Brazilian fans, and they're hanging out with big groups of Croatians. And it's cool to see the world come together for something. And there was a lot of cool little things, like the Ivory Coast team, when they played in Philly, they had a program where like kids from different schools could come and play with them and like hang out with the team, which I thought was just really cool. That it's introducing a new sport, it's getting all these countries involved, and it's just, especially for Philly, where a lot of people don't leave their neighborhood, and now they're having to like talk to a Croatian. Like, I just think it's good that it's bringing the world together for something, and it's been really cool to see.
Absolutely. I'm going to follow up on that too. It's hard not to pick this right now.
It is.
And especially the US, I mean, we've been very upset with our politics and kind of the vitriolic hate that is in this country right now. So having a moment to kind of step back, and obviously being the 250th of this country, there was going to be this whole other celebration, and I think politics kind of ruined the vibe for it. So I think without even realizing it, having the World Cup here is the best 250th celebration we ever could have asked for. There's something about like the society that gave us the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona is mind blown by a Costco. It's like, hell yeah. It's like it took the French 800 years to build Notre Dame, but they've never seen a Buc-ee's with 120 fucking gas pumps. Like, it's kind of cool as an American to like the things that we forget about, that you get these people from all over the world who are just in marvel of the Bass Pro Shop pyramid. It's like, I'll eat that up. I love it.
It is hard not to be charmed by it.
Yeah.
Not gonna lie.
No, I love it. And yeah, I feel like it's a cop out as well, low hanging fruit. But man, I was going to talk about just the World Cup too. It is so cool.
It's so fun.
To all you guys' points here is like, I think, I don't know. I have this almost like hesitance, right, with something like this going on here. Where I'm like, oh shit, like this could go bad. Like you talk about all like the immigrations, custom enforcement stuff happening, and obviously the mass amounts of tourism that are coming in for this, and players from different countries and nationalities, and it's almost like a clinch in your butt cheeks kind of thing of like, oh shit, when are we gonna fuck this up? But to my knowledge, we haven't, and it's been awesome, and it has been a unifying event, and it's been so cool to see that play out in real time and see the camaraderie of people across the world. And so I love it, and I'm Cameron, I think very well said of like, no cooler way to celebrate 250 years than having that be here, and not worrying about some like dumb event that nobody went to and all that kind of shit. But to have a World Cup, and people around the world watching it and loving it, I think it's so cool. So I'm with you guys on that.
Yeah, and in a way, it is a little bit of Jose Marti's dream kind of coming to fruition, in that it's a North American World Cup where Canada hosted games, Mexico hosted games, the USA. It wasn't just a U.S. World Cup, right? It was a North American World Cup in which those three big countries could host it and get their love and their flowers. And I also think that that's more meaningful than a lot of people realize, is that this was a shared World Cup with a continent, for a continent. And I think that's beautiful.
Yeah. Shout out to Mexico. The scenes coming out of Mexico City look so much fun. Like, the way the host can show out. I love it.
Crazy, man. What was the other game? The other night, it was like 4 a.m. there, and people were just in the streets watching, like just fired up. I'm like, holy shit, that looks incredible. But all right, fellas, we feel like we're at a good spot to wrap.
I think so.
Cool. All right. Well, we'll see everybody on part 3, and talk to you soon. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye. See you then.